Heinrich Vogel, a German immigrant cabinet maker, stood in the scorching spring sun, doing something his neighbors thought was absolutely insane. He was mortaring empty whiskey bottles into the thick adobe walls of his new home, neck first, creating strange circular patterns that caught the light like 100 glass eyes staring out at the desert. Samuel Patterson, who'd built 17 houses in the territory over 12 years, stood watching with his arms crossed and his head shaking. "Heinrich, you're wasting good mortar on trash," Patterson said, spitting tobacco juice into the red dirt. "Those bottles are going to crack with the first temperature swing. And then what? You'll have holes in your walls and scorpions crawling through them into your bedroom." 3 other men had gathered to watch what they considered entertainment bordering on tragedy. James Kirkwood, the local brick mason who'd learned his trade in St. Louis, couldn't hide his contempt. "I've been building in extreme climates for 22 years, Kirkwood said, his voice rising. "Philadelphia winters, St. Louis summers, and now this godforsaken desert. And I'm telling you, thermal mass comes from thick, solid materials, not from burying whiskey bottles like some damn drunk trying to hide evidence." Margaret Chen, who ran the general store and had lived through every brutal summer since 1883, offered her own prediction. "You'll roast in there come July, Mr. Vogel. Glass heats up fast and holds that heat. You're basically building yourself an oven." But the sharpest criticism came from Eduardo Fuentes, whose family had been building adobe structures in this region for 3 generations, long before it was American territory. "My grandfather taught me adobe construction when I was 6 years old," Fuentes said, his weathered hands gesturing at Heinrich's wall. 18 inches thick, pure earth and straw, no tricks, no additions. "That's how you survive desert heat. What you're doing makes no sense with any building tradition I know, European or Mexican. Those bottles will just create weak points where the wall cracks." What did Heinrich Vogel understand about thermal dynamics that these experienced builders, with their combined 60-plus years of construction knowledge, had completely failed to consider? Before we reveal the scientific principle that would vindicate him during the most brutal heat wave in territorial history, hit that like button, subscribe to this channel, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Now let's talk about what Heinrich was actually building and why everyone thought he'd lost his mind. Heinrich wasn't just placing bottles randomly. He'd spent 3 months collecting specific types of glass containers from every saloon, restaurant, and household in Alamogordo. He wanted thick-walled whiskey bottles, wine bottles, and beer bottles, sorted by size. He rejected thin glass. He rejected bottles with cracks. He set them in the wall with necks facing inward, bottoms facing outward, creating a 12-inch deep cavity within his 18-inch adobe walls. Between the outer adobe surface and the inner bottle layer, he left a 6-inch gap filled with dry sand. The bottles themselves were positioned horizontally, lying on their sides, embedded completely in mortar except for the circular bottom that showed on the exterior wall surface. Patterson visited the construction site on April 18th with a tape measure and a notebook, documenting what he considered evidence for a future case study in building failure. "You've got bottles every 8 inches in a grid pattern," Patterson said, measuring carefully. "That means approximately 43 bottles per 10 square feet of wall surface. Your south-facing wall alone has over 300 bottles. The structural integrity is compromised at every single bottle location." He sketched the wall cross-section in his notebook. "Standard adobe here is 18 inches thick, pure earthen mass. Your wall is 6 inches adobe exterior, 12 inches of bottles and mortar, with God knows what kind of air pockets and gaps. That's not thermal mass. That's architectural chaos." Kirkwood brought his concerns to the territorial building inspector on May 2nd. "The bottles create discontinuous thermal bridging," Kirkwood argued, using technical language he'd learned working on commercial buildings in St. Louis. "Heat transfer requires consistent material properties. Every bottle is a different density, different thickness, different air volume. You can't calculate heat capacity with that many variables. It's unscientific." He presented calculations on paper. Standard 18-inch adobe, thermal mass coefficient of roughly 30 BTU per cubic foot per degree Fahrenheit. Vogel's bottle wall, completely unpredictable, probably half that, maybe less. He's going to need twice as much fuel in winter and it'll be unbearable in summer. Margaret Chen made her prediction more personal on May 14th when Heinrich invited her to see the progress. The walls were up, the roof vigas were in place, and the bottle patterns created mesmerizing geometric designs across every wall surface. "It's beautiful, I'll give you that," Chen said, running her hand across the smooth adobe between bottle bottoms. "But Heinrich, I've lived through 8 summers here. Last July, it hit 112 degrees for 11 straight days. Inside my adobe house, thick walls, deep shade, it still reached 89 degrees by evening. Your house, with all this glass catching sunlight? You'll hit 100 degrees inside by noon. I'm worried about you, truly." Even people who weren't builders weighed in. The local doctor, William Sanders, stopped by on May 28th. "Heat exhaustion is serious business out here," Sanders said. "Last summer I treated 14 cases, 2 nearly fatal. A house that can't maintain reasonable interior temperatures isn't just uncomfortable, it's dangerous." But Heinrich just smiled, continued mortaring bottles, and said very little. He'd learned that explaining thermal principles to people convinced they already understood building science was pointless. He'd let the desert summer do the explaining for him. What Heinrich understood, and what his critics had never considered, was the principle of trapped air thermal resistance combined with radiant heat reflection and thermal mass distribution. But before we dive into the physics, we need to understand why his critics weren't just being stubborn. They were actually partially correct based on their existing knowledge. Standard adobe construction worked through pure thermal mass. Earth and straw, compressed and dried, created dense walls that absorbed heat slowly during the day and released it slowly at night. An 18-inch adobe wall weighed approximately 115 pounds per square foot. That mass had real heat capacity, about 25 to 30 BTU per cubic foot per degree Fahrenheit, depending on moisture content and density. The principle was simple. More mass equals more time for heat to penetrate. In a climate where daytime temperatures hit 105 degrees but nighttime temperatures dropped to 68 degrees, that thermal lag meant the interior never got as hot as the exterior and never got as cool as nighttime would allow. It was proven technology, centuries old, refined through generations of desert living. Heinrich's approach seemed to violate this basic principle by replacing 6 inches of that thermal mass with bottles full of air. Air has almost no thermal mass, just 0.088 BTU per cubic foot per degree Fahrenheit, roughly 1,500 times less than Earth. His critics saw those bottles and assumed he was trading proven thermal mass for worthless air pockets. What they didn't understand was that Heinrich wasn't building a thermal mass wall. He was building a hybrid system that combined thermal mass, dead air insulation, radiant reflection, and thermal decoupling in ways that traditional adobe couldn't match. Here's what was actually happening in Heinrich's wall, layer by layer, from outside to inside. The outer 6 inches of adobe provided thermal mass and weather protection, exactly as traditional construction would. That layer absorbed the intense solar radiation hitting the south and west walls during peak afternoon sun. But instead of that heat conducting directly through 18 continuous inches of earth toward the interior, it hit the first bottle layer at 6 inches depth. Those bottles, embedded in mortar but containing trapped air, created thousands of discontinuous thermal paths. Heat trying to move from the hot outer adobe toward the cooler interior had to cross from earth to glass, to trapped air, to glass, to mortar, then repeat this pattern 43 times per 10 square feet of wall. Each transition between materials with different thermal properties slowed heat transfer. Even more importantly, each bottle contained roughly 12 cubic inches of completely still air. Dead air, motionless air, is one of nature's best insulators. Its thermal conductivity is just 0.024 watts per meter Kelvin, compared to adobe's 0.6 watts per meter Kelvin. That's 25 times more resistant to heat flow. But Heinrich's system had another advantage his critics hadn't considered: radiant heat reflection. Glass, especially thick bottle glass, reflects a significant portion of infrared radiation. When heat energy radiating from the hot outer adobe layer hit the curved glass surfaces of hundreds of bottles, approximately 35 to 40% of that radiant energy bounced back toward the exterior instead of continuing toward the interior. This radiant reflection worked in both directions. In winter, radiant heat from the interior living space hit those same glass surfaces and bounced back into the room instead of conducting through to the cold exterior. The sand layer between the outer adobe and the bottles provided another function: thermal decoupling. That 6-inch sand gap, loosely packed, created additional air spaces between sand grains. It wasn't as effective as the bottle air chambers, but it added resistance. More importantly, it allowed the outer adobe layer to heat and cool with daily temperature swings without directly stressing the bottle layer with expansion and contraction forces. Heinrich had studied similar principles in German architecture, though applied differently. Korean builders had used ondol heating systems since the 4th century, moving warm air through hollow spaces beneath floors. Russian builders created double-wall log cabins with sawdust insulation in the cavity. Swedish builders used thick stone walls with interior air gaps. Native American pueblos used thermal mass, but they also used strategic shading, airflow management, and multi-layer construction. Heinrich was synthesizing principles from different traditions into something new, specific to the extreme desert climate of New Mexico territory. The exact construction process Heinrich followed was methodical and precise. Each bottle was cleaned and inspected. Cracked bottles were rejected. Bottles were sorted by size, so each wall section had consistent bottle dimensions. He mixed his mortar with more lime than standard adobe mortar, creating a stronger bond with the glass. He positioned each bottle neck inward, creating a small air channel from the bottle interior toward the inner wall surface, though he packed mortar around most of the neck to prevent air circulation while maintaining the dead air chamber inside the bottle. He arranged bottles in a hexagonal grid pattern, 8 inches on center, which provided maximum coverage with minimum structural compromise. The mortar joints between bottles were thick, maintaining structural continuity. The inner wall surface, after the bottle layer, received a final 6-inch layer of adobe, creating a continuous interior surface that looked like traditional construction from inside the house. This inner thermal mass layer absorbed heat that did penetrate through the bottle barrier during extreme conditions and radiated it back into the living space when interior temperatures dropped below the wall temperature. The total wall thickness remained 18 inches, exactly matching traditional adobe construction. But the performance characteristics were radically different. By early June 1891, Heinrich's house was complete. It had 4 rooms, each wall incorporating the bottle construction. The south and west walls, which would receive maximum solar exposure, had the densest bottle placement, 43 bottles per 10 square feet. The north and east walls had slightly less density, 34 bottles per 10 square feet, since they'd receive less direct sun. The roof was traditional vigas and adobe, 14 inches thick. Windows were small and deeply set into the wall thickness, creating natural shading. His neighbors waited for disaster. They didn't have to wait long. The summer of 1891 would provide the most extreme test possible. What none of them knew, including Heinrich, was that June through August of 1891 would bring the most sustained heat wave ever recorded in territorial New Mexico, with consequences that would nearly kill some of Heinrich's most vocal critics. June 17, 1891, the temperature hit 108 degrees Fahrenheit by 2 in the afternoon. It was the beginning of a heat siege that would last 43 consecutive days with temperatures above 104 degrees, including 17 days above 110 degrees. The territorial weather station in Alamogordo documented conditions that modern meteorologists would later classify as a once-in-50-year event. Nighttime temperatures never dropped below 78 degrees. There was no rain. Humidity stayed below 12%. Wind provided no relief, just moved hot air around like a convection oven. This wasn't normal desert summer. This was atmospheric punishment. Samuel Patterson's house, built with traditional 18-inch adobe walls, became unbearable by June 20th. Interior temperatures reached 94 degrees by late afternoon, despite wet sheets hung across windows. By nightfall, temperatures dropped only to 86 degrees, too hot for sleep. After 3 nights outside, Patterson's wife, Sarah, developed severe headaches and nausea. Their youngest child, 4-year-old Michael, became lethargic and stopped eating. James Kirkwood fared slightly better initially because his brick house had been positioned to catch prevailing evening breezes. But brick has a critical weakness in extreme sustained heat. High thermal conductivity combined with high heat capacity means that once brick heats up, it stays hot for a long time. By June 25th, after 5 straight days above 110 degrees during the day and above 80 degrees at night, Kirkwood's brick walls had fully saturated with heat. The interior temperature reached 96 degrees and wouldn't drop. Kirkwood tried every trick he knew, covered windows with canvas, created cross-ventilation, wet the roof with precious water. Nothing worked. The brick walls, now fully heat-soaked, radiated absorbed heat into the interior all night long. Kirkwood, 61 years old with a heart condition, began experiencing chest pains on June 27th. His wife Emma begged him to see Dr. Sanders. Margaret Chen's situation was similar to Patterson's. Her thick adobe walls performed as expected, which meant interior temperatures peaked around 91 to 93 degrees during the worst afternoon heat and dropped to about 84 degrees by dawn. Uncomfortable but survivable for a healthy adult. However, Margaret's elderly mother, Rosa Chen, 74 years old, couldn't regulate her body temperature effectively in sustained heat. By July 2nd, after 2 weeks of unrelenting temperatures, Rosa developed severe heat exhaustion, became confused and disoriented, and stopped drinking water. Dr. Sanders visited and warned that without a cooler environment, Rosa would likely develop full heat stroke, which at her age would probably be fatal. Eduardo Fuentes, the third-generation adobe builder who'd been most dismissive of Heinrich's bottles, suffered a different kind of crisis. His house stayed relatively cool, performing as traditional adobe should. But on July 8th, Fuentes was working on a construction project, building a wall for a client in the full midday sun. The temperature at noon was 113 degrees. Fuentes, proud and experienced, refused to stop working despite warning signs. He collapsed at 1:15 p.m. with heat stroke. 2 workers carried him home. His core body temperature measured 104.7 degrees. Dr. Sanders packed him in wet towels and warned his family that brain damage and death were real possibilities. Fuentes survived but spent 8 days unable to work, unable to contribute to his family's income during peak construction season. By July 10th, Dr. Sanders had treated 26 cases of heat-related illness. 3 had required multi-day bed rest with cool water treatments. Alamogordo's small hospital, really just 2 rooms in Dr. Sanders's house, had 4 patients with serious heat exhaustion. The town had never experienced anything like this sustained thermal assault. And it wasn't over. The forecast, such as weather forecasting existed in 1891, suggested no relief for at least 2 more weeks. On the afternoon of July 12th, with the exterior temperature at 111 degrees, Samuel Patterson walked the quarter-mile from his house to Heinrich Vogel's bottle house. Patterson hadn't slept properly in 3 weeks. His son Michael was weak and listless. Sarah had stopped cooking because the heat from the stove made their house completely uninhabitable. They were living on dried fruit, bread, and water. Patterson knocked on Heinrich's door, expecting to find similar suffering or worse, given everyone's predictions about the bottle walls. Heinrich answered the door looking fresh, healthy, energetic. He was wearing a light shirt and looked comfortable. Patterson stared at him. "How are you not dying in there?" Patterson asked, too exhausted for politeness. Heinrich smiled. "Come inside, Samuel. Bring your thermometer. I've been keeping records." Patterson stepped through the door and felt the temperature difference immediately. It was cool, not cold, not what you'd get from a spring house or root cellar, but noticeably, measurably, substantially cooler than the outside air and far cooler than Patterson's own house. Heinrich's living room felt like early morning air, that moment just after dawn before the sun asserts itself. Patterson pulled out his thermometer, a good mercury instrument he used for building assessments. He walked through each room, taking measurements. Living room, 68 degrees Fahrenheit. Kitchen, 71 degrees. Bedroom, 69 degrees. The exterior temperature, measured on Heinrich's shaded north porch, was 111 degrees. The differential was 40 to 43 degrees. Patterson sat down heavily in Heinrich's chair. "How? I need to understand how." This defies everything I know about building science. Heinrich brought out a notebook filled with temperature measurements he'd been recording 4 times daily since June 15th. The data was clear and consistent. During the entire heat wave, interior temperatures in Heinrich's house never exceeded 74 degrees, and that was during the absolute worst afternoon heat above 112 degrees exterior. Most days, the interior stayed between 66 and 71 degrees. At night, the interior temperature was actually warmer than the outside air, holding at 68 to 70 degrees, while exterior temperatures dropped to 78 degrees, because the thermal mass and insulation prevented overnight heat loss just as effectively as they prevented daytime heat gain. Before we continue with what happened next, if you're finding this story valuable and you want to see more historical building innovations that actually worked, hit that like button and drop a comment below telling me what temperature it is where you're watching from right now. Now, let's talk about what Patterson did with this information and how it spread through the community. Patterson didn't just thank Heinrich and leave. He stayed for 2 hours, examining the walls, asking questions, taking notes, measuring wall thickness at different points, trying to understand the mechanism. Heinrich explained the principle of dead air insulation, the radiant reflection from glass surfaces, the thermal decoupling of the sand layer. He showed Patterson the wall cross-section where a window opening revealed the bottle layer. Patterson could see each bottle, embedded and sealed, creating hundreds of isolated air chambers. "But air doesn't weigh anything," Patterson said, still struggling with the concept. "How can nothing be better than mass?" Heinrich explained it differently. "Mass stores heat and releases it slowly. That's good when day and night temperatures swing a lot. The mass averages them out. But when the heat is relentless, when night temperatures don't drop enough to cool the mass, traditional thermal mass becomes a liability. It saturates with heat and holds it. My bottles don't store heat. They block it. The air inside doesn't conduct heat well. The glass reflects radiant heat. The heat that's trying to get through from the outside has to cross so many barriers, through so many material transitions, that it slows down to almost nothing. By the time a little bit makes it through 12 inches of bottles and air, the interior mass has had all day to absorb it without getting hot." Patterson asked the critical question. "What about fuel costs in winter?" Heinrich smiled. "I don't know yet. This is my first year, but I predict I'll use about half the wood you use. Same principle works in reverse. Cold trying to get in has to cross the same barriers. Heat from my stove stays inside instead of conducting through the walls." Patterson nodded slowly. "I was wrong. I need to tell people I was wrong. This works." Over the next week, Patterson told James Kirkwood, who came to Heinrich's house on July 16th with his own thermometer. Suspicious that Patterson had been fooled somehow, Kirkwood measured 69 degrees interior, 109 degrees exterior, a 40-degree differential. He examined the walls carefully, looking for tricks, for hidden cooling systems, for any explanation other than the bottles actually working. There was no trick. It was just bottles, mortar, sand, and adobe, arranged in a way that created thermal performance superior to any building in Alamogordo. "I've been building for 22 years, Kirkwood said quietly, "and I just learned that I don't know everything about thermal dynamics. This is remarkable. This is actually scientifically remarkable." Margaret Chen came on July 18th with a desperate request. "Mr. Vogel, my mother is dying from this heat. She's 74 and her body can't cool itself anymore. Can she stay in your house during the worst afternoon hours? I'll pay you. I'll trade store goods, whatever you need." Heinrich didn't hesitate. "Bring her over every day. No payment needed. Bring her at noon. Let her rest here until evening. The cool will help her recover." Rosa Chen spent 3 hours daily in Heinrich's living room for the next 2 weeks. Her heat exhaustion symptoms reversed. Her confusion cleared. Her appetite returned. By August 1st, she was healthy enough that Dr. Sanders declared her out of danger. Eduardo Fuentes came last, on July 24th, still weak from his heat stroke 2 weeks earlier. He arrived without speaking, walked through the house taking measurements, examined the wall construction, sat in Heinrich's kitchen feeling the cool air, and finally spoke. "I was wrong. My grandfather was brilliant, but he built for a different climate, a different time. This is better for this place, this heat. I was wrong, and I apologize. Heinrich shook his hand. No apology needed. You didn't know because this approach isn't traditional. Traditional knowledge is valuable, but sometimes new problems need new solutions. You want to learn how to build these walls? I'll teach you every detail. By August 5th, 17 families had visited Heinrich's house to feel the temperature difference and ask about construction techniques. Heinrich spent hours explaining the bottle placement, the mortar mix, the sand layer, the importance of dead air. He gave away his knowledge freely, drew diagrams, shared his supplier sources for bottles. He didn't charge consultation fees or demand patents. He wanted people to be comfortable and safe in the desert climate. That generosity created a wave of adoption that would transform building practices across southern New Mexico territory. Between September 1891 and June 1892, 43 new structures in Alamogordo and surrounding settlements incorporated bottle walls using Heinrich's technique. Some builders used only bottles on south and west walls, keeping traditional adobe on north and east exposures. Some experimented with different bottle densities. A few tried different glass types, testing jar bottles versus whiskey bottles versus wine bottles. The general pattern held. Denser bottle placement created better insulation, but required more bottles and more labor. Optimal performance came from Heinrich's original specification: 43 bottles per 10 square feet on sun-exposed walls, 34 bottles per 10 square feet on shaded walls. Samuel Patterson built 3 houses using bottle walls in spring 1892. He documented fuel consumption data from winter 1891-1892 by comparing his own traditional adobe house against a bottle wall house of similar size. Patterson's house burned 4.2 cords of wood from November through February. The bottle wall house burned 2.3 cords, a 45% reduction. The interior temperature data showed why. Patterson's house dropped to 52 degrees on cold mornings before he restoked the stove. The bottle wall house held at 61 degrees through the night, retaining heat from the previous evening's fire. Less heat loss meant less fuel needed. James Kirkwood became a vocal advocate for bottle construction. He published an article in the territorial newspaper in March 1892 titled, "The Physics of Bottle Walls: Why German Innovation Outperforms Traditional Thermal Mass in Extreme Climates." The article included temperature data, fuel consumption comparisons, and cost analysis. Kirkwood calculated that bottle walls cost approximately 12% more than traditional adobe due to bottle acquisition and extra labor, but fuel savings paid back that cost premium within 18 months. After 5 years, the cumulative fuel savings would amount to roughly 40% of the original construction cost. Margaret Chen started stocking bottles at her general store, charging 5 cents per bottle, cleaned and inspected. By July 1892, she'd sold over 6,000 bottles for construction. Saloons and restaurants, which previously discarded bottles as trash, now had a product to sell. An informal bottle market emerged, with prices varying by size and thickness. Eduardo Fuentes recovered from his heat stroke and became one of the most skilled bottle wall builders in the territory. He combined his family's traditional adobe expertise with Heinrich's bottle technique, creating hybrid designs that preserve the aesthetic of traditional southwestern architecture while incorporating thermal performance innovations. Fuentes developed a variation where bottles were placed in decorative patterns, creating walls that were both functional and artistic. His buildings featured rosette patterns of colored glass bottles interspersed with clear bottles, creating walls that caught sunlight and glowed with amber, green, and blue tones while maintaining thermal performance. Other builders experimented with refinements. Some tried double bottle layers, placing bottles in 2 staggered rows 12 inches apart, creating even more dead air resistance. Performance tests showed this provided marginal additional benefit, maybe 8 to 12% better insulation, but nearly doubled the bottle requirement and construction time. Most builders concluded that Heinrich's single-layer approach hit the optimal cost-benefit balance. A few builders tried filling bottles with sand or water to add thermal mass, but tests showed this reduced performance because it eliminated the crucial dead air insulation. The air inside the bottles, motionless and sealed, was the critical component. By 1894, bottle wall construction had spread to Las Cruces, Socorro, and Silver City. Territorial building codes, such as they existed, were updated to recognize bottle walls as acceptable construction for residential and light commercial buildings. Some territorial officials initially resisted, arguing that building codes should require proven traditional methods. But temperature data, fuel consumption records, and 3 years of durability testing overcame resistance. Heinrich's house showed no structural problems. No bottles had cracked. No scorpions had invaded through bottle openings, as Samuel Patterson had feared. The walls were as solid as traditional adobe, but with superior thermal performance. The adoption pattern showed clear geographic correlation with climate severity. Towns with extreme summer temperatures embraced bottle walls quickly. Towns with milder climates showed less interest. This made sense. Bottle walls provided the biggest advantage in climates with sustained extreme heat or cold, where traditional thermal mass became saturated. In moderate climates, traditional construction worked fine and the extra cost of bottle walls wasn't justified. Economic analysis from 1895 showed that bottle wall buildings in Alamogordo reduced average household fuel consumption by 43% for heating and eliminated the need for expensive cooling strategies like ice delivery during summer heat waves. A typical family saved approximately $18 annually on fuel, equivalent to about 2 weeks of wages for a skilled laborer. Over a 20-year building lifetime, that amounted to $360 in savings, enough to build a small additional structure or buy quality furniture. The social impact went beyond economics. Heinrich's willingness to share his knowledge freely created a culture of building innovation in southern New Mexico territory. Other builders felt encouraged to experiment with their own ideas, knowing that if they discovered something valuable, they could share it and be respected rather than guarded and secretive. This led to additional innovations in window design, roof ventilation, and foundation techniques specific to desert construction. Former critics became innovation advocates. Samuel Patterson developed an improved mortar formula that bonded better with glass, while remaining flexible enough to handle thermal expansion and contraction. James Kirkwood designed a window setting technique for bottle walls that created deep thermal wells, increasing shading while maintaining the insulation properties. Eduardo Fuentes pioneered decorative applications that made bottle walls aesthetically desirable, not just functionally superior. These men, who'd initially rejected Heinrich's idea, became partners in refining and spreading it. Heinrich Vogel died on November 14, 1923, at age 73, in the house he'd built 32 years earlier with bottles everyone said would fail. He lived long enough to see bottle wall construction become standard practice across southern New Mexico, parts of Arizona territory, and even into northern Mexico where desert climates made the technique valuable. His house still stands today in what's now historic downtown Alamogordo, a New Mexico state historical site. Visitors can tour the structure, see the original bottle walls, and read temperature monitoring data that's been collected continuously since 1952 when the State Historical Society took over maintenance. Modern building science has validated every principle Heinrich understood intuitively. Contemporary thermal engineers recognize that his bottle walls created what's now called a multi-layer thermal barrier system, with characteristics similar to modern insulated concrete forms or structural insulated panels. Research published by New Mexico State University's College of Engineering in 2003 analyzed Heinrich's original structure using thermal imaging and computational fluid dynamics modeling. The study confirmed that the bottle walls achieve an effective R value of approximately R22 to R24, comparable to modern insulated walls, despite using no synthetic materials or industrial products. The near loss of this traditional knowledge illustrates a broader historical pattern. Throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries, countless building innovations developed by immigrants and indigenous people were dismissed by established practitioners, documented poorly if at all, and nearly forgotten as industrial building materials and standardized techniques replaced regional adaptations. Heinrich's technique survived primarily because he built in a place where extreme climate made the performance difference impossible to ignore, and because he lived long enough to see adoption reach critical mass. How many other innovations, equally clever and equally functional, disappeared because the inventor died before crisis validated the approach, or because established builders successfully suppressed the technique, or simply because no one bothered to document it? Contemporary sustainable building movements have rediscovered bottle wall construction. Modern builders in New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, and other arid regions use bottle walls in eco-friendly homes, though now they call it thermal mass decoupling with dead air barrier integration, and write research papers about it. The bottles are often decorative colored glass, purchased specifically for construction rather than recycled whiskey bottles from saloons. The principle remains identical to what Heinrich Vogel demonstrated in 1891. Trapped air resists heat transfer, glass reflects radiant energy, and material discontinuity creates thermal barriers more effective than simple mass. The lesson extends beyond building science into epistemology and cultural humility. Established expertise, genuine experience, and traditional knowledge are all valuable, but they can also create intellectual blindness. Samuel Patterson had built 17 houses successfully. James Kirkwood had 22 years of experience in multiple climates. Eduardo Fuentes represented 3 generations of proven building tradition. They weren't stupid or stubborn. They were experienced professionals who couldn't imagine that an untested immigrant with broken English might understand something they didn't. Their initial rejection of Heinrich's bottles came from reasonable application of existing principles. They were wrong not because they were incompetent, but because they assumed their current knowledge was complete knowledge. Heinrich's success came partly from technical insight, but equally from intellectual humility and empirical honesty. He didn't argue with critics. He didn't write defensive essays. He built his house, measured the performance, and let the data speak. When the heat wave came, he didn't gloat over his critics' suffering. He opened his home to Rosa Chen, shared his knowledge freely with everyone who asked, and helped former skeptics become practitioners of the technique he'd pioneered. That generosity and lack of ego allowed his innovation to spread, rather than die with him as proprietary secret knowledge. Today, if you visit Heinrich Vogel's house in Alamogordo, you can place your hand on the bottle walls, feel the cool glass on a hot summer day, and understand viscerally what Patterson felt when he first stepped into that house in July 1891. The temperature differential isn't magic or mystery. It's physics, carefully applied, proven through crisis, refined through iteration, and preserved through generous teaching. Those bottles aren't trash embedded in walls. They're evidence that innovation can come from anywhere, that expertise sometimes creates blind spots, and that the most valuable knowledge is knowledge shared freely. Give this video a like, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me what other historical building techniques you want me to investigate. Next time, we're diving into how a Norwegian fisherman in Alaska invented a preservation technique for salmon that the commercial canneries said was impossible, but that prevented scurvy and saved lives during the winter of 1897. You won't believe what he did with ice, seawater, and a principle nobody understood until 50 years later.